Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. You can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. And also don't forget to check out my Substack. So today's episode is going to be about the stages of collapse. So, of course, I've been on the last year talking about collapse itself as a process, the fact that it's likely going on in the United States, and broadly the industrial world as a whole. So I'll sort of sketch out what I believe to be the broad trends that will govern this process as it leads to its final termination in a new equilibrium. So before we get started, we have in the chat Vingel, N Credits, Goatman, and Sergeant Jazero. Hello, everybody. Okay, so we're going to divide this into broadly three categories, right? There's where we are right now, which I'll call the current period. Okay, then there's the continuing drop in energy consumption, and then there's the new equilibrium. Now, the collapse, okay, to use Joseph Tainer, which is the definition I'm using, is moving from a high energy state to a low energy state. Higher energy states tend to be complex and brittle, whereas low energy state systems tend to be redundant and resilient. And so with then within that, we have the catabolic collapse, which is from John Michael Greer. The idea being that the collapse doesn't happen all at once, it happens in stages. So basically, we live in a system of systems. The metasystem, which I identify with the global technological system, is composed itself of many subcomponents, which are systems in their own right. If we look at the North American context, we are at the apex of the energy consumption in the world. The system of systems I will call the American Empire. One of the global metas for the next couple of centuries is the total decline in energy extraction and consumption, which will, by the power of necessity, compel governments, corporations, and individuals to consume less energy. This hard limit will drive collapse. This is the result of EROIs and energy access, of which I have discussed in other places and need not be reiterated here. So, for example, beginning the Industrial Revolution with the use of coal in the early 19th century, continuing, well, according to John Michael Greer, well up into the 70s, we had ever-increasing levels of energy consumption. So each decade would have produced higher levels of energy consumption than the one before. The idea being that you could then expand to grow technological infrastructure based on that. But now we're getting to a point where it's plateauing and then going down. Even if it plateaued, the drive to keep growing would hit a hard limit, i.e. you can't get more energy out. But also, now that it's going down due to extraction costs, in an analogous way or in an inverse way, it will constrain future economic development. Rather than allowing for a lot of opportunities to grow, it'll lead to a lot of opportunities to shrink, though there will be some growth in some sectors, and we'll get into that later. We are already in the process of catabolic collapse, which, according to John Michael Greer, began sometime in the 1970s. We can look at this perspective through the lens of economic energy use. We can envision concentric circles radiating out from the center, where the center is the most essential and the outer rings progressively less essential. I view the economic energy use contract to be broadly in three categories: consumer goods, industrial goods, and government services. Consumer goods can be subdivided into luxuries and necessities. Luxuries will be fashion, beauty products, luxury cars, electronics, etc. Necessary goods are food, clothing, shoes, etc. Industrial goods can be viewed as the entire process of extracting natural resources to transporting them to be manufactured to being shipped to the store as a finished product. Government, so that would be like basically the what Lenin had in the NEP, where he had the quote, the heavy industry versus the light industry. So heavy industry would be like the production and manufacturing, resource extraction and manufacturing, whereas light industry would be like consumer goods, both of the luxury and necessary variety. And then the last one would be government services, such as utilities, the police, and the military. So as we go into the downward trend of collapse in energy consumption, consumer luxury goods will go first. They take a lot of energy to produce, but they don't produce anything of value back. So they'll just go. Now, you might always say, well, the elites will always have luxuries. Sure. But like for most people, that's just not even going to be reasonable to think about. The next thing will be necessary consumer goods will still be produced, but at a lower and lower quantity levels, right? So you'll still have to produce food, obviously, but you'll be able to produce food at a lower level. We could also probably assume more ersatz food, more chemicals and seed oils and watering down and cutting to make it even, quote, cheaper to make. In fact, starvation might hit before total industrial breakdown. Think of Russia in 1917. They had bread riots, which led to the February Revolution. Then the broader industrial system will contract, and those industrial processes and resource extraction methods that do not directly service the acquisition of energy, so that'd be coal, oil, natural gas, or the maintenance of security, the police, the military, will be gradually phased out. Lastly, before final collapse, the government will be the last entity with the lights on, so to speak. Then we get to a new equilibrium, which will in many ways be worse than North America in 1800 before the Industrial Revolution. All the natural resources have been exploited and contaminated, so we will have a level of existence far below 1800 for a time, unless clever people find ways of utilizing the remains of civilization. So, for example, while on the one hand, we don't have herds of buffalo and forests all over the place and, salmon in the streams like we did in 1800, there's a lot of scrap and salvage that could be used, which could presumably allow for a higher population than what one might otherwise suspect. And I'll get to that a little bit later. We could also view the phases of collapse from a political lens rather than economic. As the American empire strapped for energy, it will withdraw its security forces from areas of the country deemed not essential. We already see this in many urban areas where the police are not active due to high threat levels, right? So their goal is to contain the threat in those urban areas rather than to quash it. And that precedent will just expand throughout the country. This will lead to the formation of local bottom-up authorities. As we currently see in urban areas, we can see the rise of gang and interpersonal conflict. We can likely expect this pattern to repeat in the larger areas. The violence that will develop, I do not perceive, will be long-lasting. The chronic gang violence today is only the result of high-energy society we live in. As soon as a gang member gets shot or stabbed, he is sent to the hospital. In areas that the government has left and deemed it not essential, there won't be that kind of medical care. Violence will likely spike for a few years or even decades, but then the realization will sink in that we cannot have all of our young men getting treated like this, and other forms of conflict resolution will develop. What the government holds on to will be those geographic areas that are economically and strategically vital, which were likely to be a necklace of government locations throughout the country that do not seem to make any sort of coherent sense in the sense of like a unified territory. It'll kind of look like some of these like medieval patchwork kingdoms where like one royal house has territories all over Europe that are not contiguous. Something like that. As they give more and more ground away because they can't protect it, it's deemed inessential and it's just left to the wolves. A good example of what that might look like is what we see in the novel World War Z, where the government just leaves people to fend for themselves under the zombie source. Except, of course, I don't talk about zombies, but I think the overall government strategy would likely be that. This might lead to high-risk, high-reward convoy escort missions to isolated government locales. So, for example, we might have, again, like centralized hubs of governments, but then they'll have like these outposts that don't seem to make a lot of sense from the point of view of defending them, but because they either protect or because they either allow access to some raw material or some manufacturing system that is not easily replaced and was put there in a prior era under high energy constraints, which were little to none. They didn't think too much about where they were going to put this factory, this mining operation. So I could see a whole subculture of convoys and escort missions being developed, which would pay a lot of money if you could, pull it off. I could definitely see that. Oh, and if anything like Mad Max would develop, it would develop in these sort of attempts to attack these government convoys. Also, the government and those who work for it will still have access to technology and its conveniences and will thus attract a lot of the remaining talent, that or impress them by force to keep the show running. Once a sufficiently large area has been vacated by the government, they might send in armed forces, paramilitary militia, to do smash and grab raids to get vital resources. Right, like for example, they might have had to abandon a region that did contain some factories, which were not deemed essential enough to protect, but they might, raid it for machine tools, right, or something. And they won't stay there, they'll just take it and go. As the interconnected manufacturing system breaks down, the large-scale production of firearms and ammunition will cease. Another reason for a limitation of violence during the collapse is the rationing of precious ammunition to maintain power. The American Empire and smart successors will impose strict rules of engagement to limit firearms use to preserve stocks. The process of cannibalization cannot go on forever. Either the American Empire falls as it eats itself to find energy, as Ungoliant did, or it will change and develop a new post-technological economy and use what it has left to hold onto power. Though, given the nature of the people who run the U.S. government today, I'm not holding my breath on that one. Now, then there's a question of how violent will the collapse be? In the short term, I think it could be pretty violent, especially in cities as competition for scarce resources drives conflict. As I have speculated elsewhere, I and others foresee a major drop in population to occur along with the fall in energy consumption. Once we approach a population in North America that can be sustained by the environment itself, in 1500 it was about 10 to 15 million Native Americans at most. We can maybe see 20 million in all of the US-Canada region. At this level, violence will not be driven by resource access pressures since the consumption of resources has gone down, as well as population density. Lack of medical care and limits on gun ammunition will also impose strategic considerations to cause the competing factions to limit violence. So, an actual historical example of where this might occur would be the 30 Years' War in Europe. Everybody took the gloves off. It was a bloodbath, and at the end of it, both the Protestant and Catholic nations were like, we can't do this again. We can't afford another war like this. So they started imposing lots of rules. This began the golden age of diplomacy, which broke down really in the First World War. So we can see that once the cost of violence gets so high that even the winner loses, i.e. a Pyrrhic victory, we can then see a shift in the overall consensus of everybody concerned. So there is historical precedent for this, and I think if we follow the patterns that affected history, it will likely yield similar results in the future, though the details, the specifics, will of course be different. Furthermore, commissar-style tactics of enforcement will likely not work in the U.S. since there is a national consensus against heavy-handed measures. All the neighboring tribes would come down and destroy you. Right, so you might want to run some sort of ruthless gang, for decades or centuries afterwards, but I think it's going to be a lot harder. One, there's going to be fewer people in general, so you can't, have this massive bureaucracy push people around and threaten them to do what you want. And Americans in general don't like that. The age of conscription was relatively short, about 100 years from Abraham Lincoln till Vietnam. Before that and after that, we had a volunteer army. So I think that would be difficult and would certainly run the risk of getting everybody to turn against you in the same way that Hitler got everybody to turn against him. Along with wide open spaces for people to desert to, conscription, impressment, and other methods will not succeed for long. Ammo scarcity will likely mean that owners of salvage piles will turn a blind eye to raiding parties since it's not worth the ammo cost. So overall, I would say the further we get into collapse, the intensity of violence is going to go down. And I think also the incidents of violence are going to go down for all of those reasons and more. If you ride down to the equilibrium, so as you approach equilibrium, which is going to be, and again, in this context, I define equilibrium as a population that can be sustained by the environment that it lives in, right? There's always going to be some importation. There's always going to be some trade. You can't be totally autarkic. I get that. But by and large, you're not importing vast quantities of resources to hold up a megalopolis like New York City, for example. Two groups of people will flourish: reenactors and motor shop guys. If you ever go to a historical reenactment village or a camp, you will see men and women working in a very low-tech way: glass blowers, basket weavers, smithing, butter making, etc. These men and women will have very useful and practical skills that will be in high demand when the electricity goes out. They will be kings and queens until a new economic order takes shape and they are no longer special. Until then, they can write their own contracts and do more or less as they please, since people will not be able to do without their wares. The former butt of jokes will be the kingmakers. Men that work at motor shop will be the salvagers in the age of salvage, where all the proverbial bones of the machine are stripped down and metal and plastic is put to some other use. Jerry-rigging, hot wiring, soldering, and metal cutting will be crucial skills for helping people utilize the materials they have to make something new. So yeah, basically the guys that work at a junkyard or the guys that work at a car repair, they'll be able to like convert all of this junk into something marginally useful. So they'll also be extremely valuable in the future in this process. And are they the only two groups? No, you could also include people that could provide some sort of security, people that perform, so they'd be like, ex-military, ex-police, ex-gang members, whatever. Also, you could include people who provide some sort of arbitration service, because once medicine goes away and you get shot and you die and you can't go to the hospital to get the bullet out, people who are able to negotiate settlements without having to go to blows become a lot more valuable all of a sudden. Like I said, after the 30 Years' War, we had the golden age of diplomacy. War was more or less a scripted art where a few guys marched around and fired at each other, but it wasn't like going to be a serious bloodbath like we would see in the First World War. They'll be important too. But those two groups are sort of more self-evidently valuable in a collapse, those that can provide security and those that can provide diplomatic negotiation skills. I felt the other two were less obviously valuable. So I made a special case for them. The other driving factor of collapse will be population collapse. As the population declines, violence and consumption will decline with it. Yet, if we have anyone left at all, women will have to return to their natural role as wives and mothers. Many women will not accept this fate, and the tribes that prop them up will die. The infinite energy cost of pathological female behavior will not be able to be met. Collapse will hit women the hardest. They will have the most to lose and be totally unable to stem the tide. The sooner they accept these realities, the better off they will be. The entire child economy, which the caste nexus fails to adequately account for, will develop again and be held together through a complex system of kinship, duties, or religious obligations. Patriarchy will be the only game in town. Yeah, there's going to be a ton of communities that just completely go sideways because they just allow these, nervous Nellies to just control how resources are disposed. Unless they just get, slapped down and thrown in a cage or something, it'll just be a very poor use of resources. And of course, especially with the issue of violence, given that we have an aging population and there's fewer younger people than older people, and it's usually young men that drive violence, how much violence will we actually see, especially after the early stages where the low inhibition, low intelligence people kill themselves off? Probably not as much as you might think. And there's going to be a huge pressure to reproduce. So any successor state, even what remains of the government, will likely seek to enforce women to do this, because the only way things turn around is when they have to start doing it. And those groups that can get ahead of the curve first will be the best off. Post-collapse America, I think, will be a lot like post-Columbian America, a vast continent with a lot of potential and a very small population base. This time, instead of a smallpox epidemic, it'll be a variety of factors that took people out. So, if we look at all of this, these are, one, trends that we can observe throughout historical societies and their collapse. We can also see that, I think, from the best evidence we have, this is also what we can expect to see from the technological angles of the wild card. That's the new thing that was introduced to the human meta. But I think we have had enough people studying it and critiquing it to come up with a fairly good idea of what its limitations are and the cost that it imposes on ourselves, but more specifically here, the environment, so that how long it will be able to last until it just folds. And then, Because ultimately, the people who control the machine or attempt to control it are going to be the people that determine which goods get produced, which services get produced, and which part of the country doesn't get what it needs, right? And so I think actually, though, given the example I mentioned above of the government just withdrawing from parts of the country and just leaving it as wide open spaces with little to no active, it's just all about containment, right? The police are just there to contain anything in those areas. It'll move from cities to counties to even maybe states. Depending on which counties and which states, that might actually be a very good thing, because a lot of people complain about the government being the boot on their neck. And if there's not a lot of urban areas where you're going to get overflow from refugees and violent gangs, that could be quite nice, because you'd have a very low population density. You'd have the absence of this top-down authoritarian system, and you'd finally be able to sort of do what you've always wanted to do but couldn't do because of regulators and the police and whatever. You might envision a situation like that out west, where you don't have a lot of urban centers, a lot of self-reliant people. They would probably do quite well. In fact, things might actually improve for them when the government moves out, in some regards. But in other regards, they'd still lose access to energy, which would suck in a lot of other ways. Groups that are likely to fill the gap. Well, the Mormons are always my top pick. They have, every Mormon is required to be a prepper. They may not be, but enough are. And unlike the preppers, who are all, lone wolf libertarian types that don't work together, the Mormon church is able to organize these people to work towards common goals. So they have almost all the benefits of being preppers, but very little of the downsides. So the transition period, I think they could navigate. One, the Mormons are survivors. They've already demonstrated they can carve out a living in a harsh environment. With what they've stored up, they could presumably consume the stores as they come up with new solutions. So I think that would be one. We're tempted to think that people that are extremely ruthless and cruel and bloodthirsty will be successful, and they will be for a time. And you'll have regional groups, maybe even the government, that goes into these sort of more, draconian, almost like, Dark Age style barbarian tactics that were, we see this in Mexico with the cartels, so that's definitely possible. But it's going to be harder in the United States for quite a few reasons. One, the rural population is heavily armed, unlike in Mexico, where gun ownership is strictly regulated, unless you're in the cartels. Because what do you know? Criminals don't abide by government regulations. Who knew? It's going to be a lot harder for these guys to leave the cities and then start pillaging rural and suburban areas. I think what's going to happen is they're going to realize that these people are armed and what they have isn't worth the taking. So they'll end up just fighting each other. You might have like a Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun type gang leader that unites all the gangs. Or maybe, if they're smart, they'll be like the Italian mob under Lucky Luciano and just, say, let's stop fighting each other, guys, and work together to do business. In fact, once the body count gets too high and and people realize, hey, the people that don't get killed are likely going to be the high intelligence, high impulse control types. They'll be like, well, hey, you know what? Let's just trade. Let's just do business. It's going to be better than killing each other off. The mob has done that before, so I wouldn't organize crime, just like governments and civil societies, understands the benefits of this. So I think we could likely see that in a long enough time frame. Anybody that tends to be overly cruel, that tortures, murders, rapes, enslaves people, would likely just get ganged up on and stomped to pieces. I don't think anybody in America would tolerate that for too long. A good example would be something like the Mormons, right? They themselves, when they went to Utah, it was still a part of Mexico. Like, nobody would put up with their antics. And I think if anybody tried anything like so far outside of the American frame, they would get a treatment much like the 19th century Mormons did. But I guess there would be places to run, wouldn't there? But the government could probably pull this off better than any gang could, because they have the firepower and the technology to do so. But then there'd be the forced discipline of limited ammunition stocks. And if you have vehicles, limited fuel stocks. So the one thing I forgot to mention is you'd see a huge demand in horse breeding and horses. You'd have horse breeders, horse trainers, horse sellers, and horses would just explode all over again. So I guess the Amish would be doing great. They'd be doing really good during all this. And the guys out west that still do like, cowboy stuff, they do well too because they already have the built-in infrastructure. They just have to grow. So they could also be very successful in this new meta. And the vehicles and ammo stocks would be preserved. Their value would primarily be as a deterrent, as a threat. Like, I could use this if I wanted to, and it would blow you away, but I don't want to use that because then, you can't blow everybody away, right? And so if you blow one faction away, the other faction comes and attacks you and you're out of ammo, and then you're done. So it's more like, it's kind of the same rationale as mutually assured destruction. You want to have it, but you don't really want to use it. The problem is if that goes on too long, all the stuff is going to get mothballed and people are going to forget how to use it. So there is that downside as well. We're also going to see, I think, the groups that are not very well positioned to survive this are anybody that's not religious. So super religious people, the Mormons, they're shooing. The Amish and the Mennonites, as long as they can, dissuade violent gangs, should do pretty well. I mean, I think they could fall back on their religious cohesion. Evangelicals, I think, are too libertarian-y. I don't know, maybe. Libertarians are toast. Like, anybody that's an individualist is just toast. You're done. Gone. Where the age of individualism was a luxury of cheap energy. Now you're going to have to be a team player. And if you're not going to be a team player, you're gone. That also implies the end of feminism. You're gone. If you're not going to be a team player, you're gone. And so those groups would not do very well. People that are chronically ill, they're done. They could make lifestyle decisions before or during that would allow them to function to some degree. But how many will actually do that? Who knows? Probably not that many. The real question is how can one position oneself to be as resilient as possible in these ways? That will be tomorrow's show, so I won't get too much into that. That'll be tomorrow's show. Then the thing is, with regards to consumption and then transitioning to local production, that's going to be hard, right? A lot of the soil has been eroded. A lot of the soil has been polluted with pesticides. So that'll be touch and go for a while until we can figure out how to either work around it or, detox the soil, so to speak. And the thing is, it's funny, right? If everybody's going to be like raiding, the grocery stores and the vending machines, but like, all that food is just totally terrible. It's just seed oil garbage. Literally, you eat that stuff, you're probably going to actually not live as long in this new age. So, because it's just going to give you hyperinflammation. You can't function in these high stress environments when you're hyperinflamed. It's game over. You're going to have to see, this is actually the funny part, right? If you know what real food is and you go for it, you'll just miss all the conflict. Because all the conflict over food is going to be over 200 years ago and every era before that, cows were food. You eat the cows, you eat the milk. Most people don't know where the beef comes from. They don't even they think, the grocery store grows the beef. So they won't even go for the cows because even if they did kill it, they wouldn't know how to butcher it. And they wouldn't think cow's milk is food. So if you actually could figure out what real food is before the end, you will actually have a lot of competition because people just won't even be thinking about it as food and they'll just go right past you. It's like, you're just sitting there with your cow drinking milk and nobody cares because they don't think either of that's food. They're going to want some, deep fried junk food with some soda pop. Okay. Well, you're not going to last long on that diet. So that'll be interesting. We could also probably expect security being produced by relatively older men. I guess in this case, he'd be like Gen X, older millennials. Younger millennials and Gen Z, I don't think there's enough of them and enough healthy ones to actually be the purveyors of violence one way or the other, for defense or for offense. So that's another issue we're gonna have to think about. I mean, it's all relative, of course. I mean, if you have like, aging boomers going up against skinny jean zoomers, it's not like it's Trojans versus Greeks, not by a long shot. So it is kind of relative. So I don't quite know what that's going to entail. It is interesting to think about how people today who are like otherwise considered niche curiosities, like people that work at like a Renaissance fair or like in a colonial America sites or something, will actually be hugely important because they know how to do things without technology, without energy, that people have forgotten. And or like the Amish with their horses, all of a sudden that's going to be a big deal now. Now, one of the downsides, of course, is both the Amish and the Mormons have integrated with the global economy, and so transitioning away from that will be difficult. But I think they're better positioned to navigate that challenge. Atheists, they're toast. They're gone as well. They're antisocial individualists. Unless you have a revival of Marxism. But Marxism is a kind of scientific utopian belief system. I think Marxism just won't survive this. You might have a kind of collective ownership philosophy, but it won't be Marxism. It'll probably have more in common with like earlier ancient societies, like maybe Sparta or the heretical Zoroastrian Mazdakites. But I don't think it'll be Marxism. I don't think Marxism will survive. These 20th century ideologies are predicated on industry, science, technology, and high energy, and they won't be very successful. So I don't think that's going to work as well. The interesting thing to consider as well is navigation, right? Most people navigate now using GPS. I navigate using GPS. Most people travel on roads because we travel with cars. But all of a sudden, navigation is going to be a lot more touch and go because you won't be able to have GPSs. I mean, you could still dust off your maps. And since things aren't going to move, cities aren't going to move around, roads aren't going to move around, old maps could still work because they were pretty good. But then, would you be driving or would you be using a horse? And if you were using a horse, you might go cross country. You might not be limited to roads as much. And especially if you're traveling by foot, you wouldn't be limited by roads as much. So population migration patterns would be much less predictable than they are now because we wouldn't be artificially constrained in our transportation choice. Horses can go pretty much anywhere. The closest modern equivalent to a horse is a motorcycle, but they also take fuel. So, motorcycles will have to actually in the collapse period before petrochemicals become just unusable full stop, you might actually see cars phased out in favor of motorcycles. Because motorcycles are going to use less gas, and they're going to be, you can go off road with them a little bit easier than with cars. So you might see a rise in that. So biker gangs would probably do good for a while until they killed each other off. They start fighting with each other a lot, and that's not going to end well. Here's the thing, even with smart gang leaders that try to limit the fighting, they can't always do it. And of course, when the medicine dries up, game over. That I think is going to be a huge shock for people too. Once modern medicine goes away, if you can have stores of it, you can then leverage that as power for a time. But eventually that's going to run out and you'll have to return to some sort of 19th century level of medicine. Now, it's funny, right? We'll still have learned things about the human body and sickness and disease that they didn't know in the 19th century or the 18th century, but we won't have the modern technology to go with it. So that'll be interesting. It'll lead to a whole new set of protocol and treatment. It'll have treatment that on the face of it looks like 19th century treatment, but will be slightly different in that it's informed by 20th and 21st century knowledge of the human body, which at the time was not known by any of those people who were using those similar tools before. So that's another change that will affect all of this. We'll likely see a rise in religiosity amongst the survivors because they're going to have to, even now, right? Even now, before we get to the deep stages of collapse, many of the voices of new atheism have since admitted defeat and that Christianity is actually necessary. We have Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, who are now pretty buddy-buddy with the Southern Baptists. Even Richard Dawkins has stated the new atheist movement has failed and that we can't defeat the transgender movement without Christians. So if that's the case now, it's going to be exponentially more the case in the future. I just don't see that surviving. The other thing that'll go away is this annoying habit of liberals. It's a broadly liberal habit of liberal societies, but also conservatives and libertarians do this too. Concern trolling, caring about other people, other things in the world that have no direct relevance to you, because I guess you just have enough free time to harangue people about it. People who do that will just get slapped down because it's like, hey, life is hard enough. We got real issues to solve. I don't care what's going on in another state, let alone another side of the world. That'll be nice to see go away because it's just meant to prevent anything. A lot of these high energy behaviors are meant to prevent anything from happening. We're just locked in this grid of dead heat, which will be fatal in a collapse situation. And the people that realize that the soonest will be the most likely to survive. And if you never figure it out, you're just gone. Bye-bye. It's over. You got locked in the dead heat of surrogate activities and then you die. So I think that the sort of harsh, if you read novels or histories from the 19th century, people could die crossing a river. People could die from something falling on their head like a tree branch. And we're not used to those kinds of things. People, if they do die, they're behind closed doors in a hospital. These kinds of near brushes with death will just be normal. And people will have to acclimate themselves to it. And many won't be able to because they've sheltered themselves for so long from anything like this. And that's going to be bad. That's going to be, ultimately, I think most people who don't survive will not survive because of psychological codependence on the machine. Whatever part of the machine they're codependent on that helps them get by with all their psychological problems, they'll just die. I mean, John Michael Greer predicts there'll be suicide parties. You dump a bunch of pills into Kool-Aid and start drinking until you take yourself out. Probably. So yeah, I forgot suicide. How can I forget that? That'd be another huge component to all this. So I think a lot of people would just cell phone. And if you're smart and keep your head down and find the right place to weather the storm, it'll have its challenges. It's not going to be a cakewalk, but I don't think it's going to be Mad Max if you play your cards right. If you don't and you're in downtown Manhattan when it happens, well, sucks to be you, I guess. So to reiterate all of this, we've got three broad trajectories. Our current period of reduced energy consumption, but then the drop that goes, it's really severe where everybody starts to notice it. And we start to see a change in the use of resources. And then the new equilibrium. We have basically three kinds of energy consumption: consumer goods, industrial goods, and political goods. Consumer luxury goods will go first, then consumer necessity goods will be reduced. The big, economic corporations that extract raw materials, produce raw materials, they'll exist, but only insofar as they can either prop up energy extraction or security. And then, if the government collapses completely, it will be once they run out of any energy at all. They'll be the last guy with the lights on. Now, then you could also have the phases of political collapse that withdraw from certain areas, no man's land. That could either be really violent, like if it's an urban area, or it could be pretty nice if it's a low population density area and you just kind of have, room to stretch your legs. And then the government will contract slowly in phases, holding on to these key resources. Now, there'll be certain areas they won't want to give up because they know that they'll need it for their preservation. Those groups, so they'll fight really hard for those. Furthermore, people with skills, especially technical skills, military skills, will be induced through voluntary or maybe even involuntary means to work for the government to keep everything going. And of course, you still get the benefits of what's left of technology. I think violence will spike immediately after this tipping point, and then it'll go down because population will go down, which means the competition for resources goes down. No more medical care. People will quickly realize, hey, if I get shot, I might actually die. Ammo stocks, those that deplete their ammo stocks will be toast, and those that survive will realize, hey, we need to actually save them as a deterrent rather than use them all up at once. So they'll impose strict rules of engagement. And we'll likely see that develop. The government, of course, will still tax the base that it has. We'll probably raid neighboring areas for more resources. So just again, I said machine tools. And then we'll have the rise of people who are currently now just seen as curiosities, people that run junkyards, people that work at these reenactment centers, because they'll actually have practical, useful skills. The salvage crews will be useless once the scrap's all used up, but that'll take a while. So they have probably a good century before they're out of commission. The people that work at these reenactment centers at Glassblow and stuff, they'll be good just for the future. I mean, they won't be as profitable in the future because there'll be more people to compete with, but early on, they'll be the kingmakers. And then we'll be back to a population level sort of like what was around, I think, when Columbus showed up, because people will be gone once the surplus population is propped up by the level of energy consumption and technological forces. With that being gone, however they are eliminated through famine or war or whatever, these people are going to be gone. And then, of course, the people that survive, it won't be random. It'll be people that have, that can plan ahead, that can control their impulses, that have embraced healthy lifestyles, that are a part of closely knit communities that punish antisocial behavior. And so that last bit, how to survive, what steps you can take, that'll be tomorrow's show. All right, so that's all I got for today. Let's see what the chat has to say. Cyber Ninja Zero, how are you feeling, Todd? Well, I'm feeling tired, but otherwise good. GF, hello. Vingul, hello. Minoan, hello. Jorge Punta, Voltro, Robert Jordan, T, Kieran Roberts, hello. All right. Polish Minoan, our patronage network, yes, there'll be those for sure. Polish Ambassador, Amazon has collapsed, billions must scavenge. Yes. Cyber Ninja Zero, Genghis Kang. Yeah, there we go. Let's see. Amazon bot jokes, funny. John Goras, lynching for horse thieves. Everything old becomes... Yeah, actually, yeah. That'll happen too. Vingo, libertarianism is just Satanism by another name. Yes, it is. Let's see. Record deepness. How to become more resilient if anything happens. Trick. 1, get to know your neighbors. You mean your neighbors now? They may not be alive. Or your neighbors in the future. So that depends. But let's see. Lame whales fighting over a Big Mac. Yep. That's going to happen. Let's see. John Goris. Lots of people would literally go crazy without their fast food. Yep. Cyber Ninja Zero. Biggest question. How rampant will cannibalism be in the collapse? I know, one side of me wants to say it'll be very common, but I think another part of me would say that it wouldn't be, because there's a certain level of visceral knowledge of see, it's easy to be a cannibal when you know how to slaughter and kill a cow. You just do the same thing to a human. But most people don't know how to do that. They can't slaughter and kill a cow. They can't slaughter and kill a goat. So if you even lack those skills, I could just see a bunch of people sitting around somebody who's dead trying to figure out what to do with them, because they don't even know. That's how far removed they are. And it's yeah, I'm not sure. I guess it depends. Not for lack of will, but more for lack of capacity. Cyber Ninja Zero, the man with the last Google map is king. Jorge Punta, motorcycles are quite efficient. Yeah, they are. Cyber Ninja Zero, Fallout was right. The biker cons will rule the gangs. Well, until the gas runs out. Record deepness. I think that long-term migration will also just be less since traveling by foot or horse is hard going compared to cars. Yes. There'll also be fewer people. So yes. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, GF, painful but normal is most of history. JLM, howdy y'all. Voltra, make it easier to skin a fish. All right, everyone. That's all I got for tonight. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Fly podcast, signing off.